The radar screen glowed green in the dimly lit bunker beneath the Ural Mountains, casting shadows across Colonel Dmitry Volkov's weathered face as he watched the familiar blips dance across Soviet airspace. For 15 years, he had commanded this sector of the motherland's air defense network, a sprawling constellation of radar stations, surface-to-air missile batteries, and interceptor squadrons that formed an impenetrable shield around the world's largest nation. His men operated with the precision of a Swiss watch, tracking every aircraft that dared approach their borders, ready to scramble fighters within minutes of any incursion. The system was their pride, built with the blood and genius of Soviet engineering, a testament to their technological prowess that rivaled anything the Americans could deploy. Outside, the winter wind howled across the frozen landscape, but inside this concrete fortress, Volkov felt invincible, protected by layers of redundancy and firepower that made the very idea of penetration seem laughable. Every officer under his command shared this confidence, this unshakable belief that no aircraft could violate Soviet airspace without facing immediate and overwhelming response. The Cold War had transformed air defense into something almost sacred, a holy mission that defined their existence and justified the countless hours spent in these underground chambers. Young lieutenants monitored their consoles with reverent attention, calling out coordinates and vectors in crisp military cadence, their voices echoing through the operations center like prayers in a cathedral. Along the vast Soviet borders, similar bunkers stretched from the Baltic to the Pacific, each one connected by secure communication lines that could coordinate a response involving thousands of personnel within heartbeats. The Americans had learned their lesson after the incident 4 years prior, when their spy plane fell from the sky like Icarus, its pilot captured and paraded before the world's cameras in a humiliating display of Western arrogance. Punished. Volkov had celebrated that day with vodka and toasts, convinced that no enemy would dare such foolishness again. The network of S-75 missile systems could reach heights previously thought impossible, creating a ceiling of destruction that extended into the stratosphere itself. This was the shield of the Soviet Union, and Volkov was its guardian. In a hangar hidden deep within the Nevada desert, illuminated only by harsh fluorescent lights that buzzed like angry insects, a shape emerged from the shadows that would redefine the boundaries of human flight and shatter Soviet confidence forever. The project had begun in secrecy years before, born from the ashes of humiliation when an American pilot was captured over hostile territory, his aircraft brought down by missiles that proved the stratosphere was no longer sanctuary. Lockheed's Skunk Works division had assembled the nation's brightest minds, engineers who dreamed in equations and dared to imagine an aircraft that could fly faster than a rifle bullet, higher than any missile could reach, constructed from materials that could withstand temperatures hot enough to melt lead. The result stood before them like something from a science fiction novel, its dark titanium skin absorbing light rather than reflecting it. Twin engines capable of generating thrust beyond anything previously conceived. They called it the Blackbird, and it represented America's answer to vulnerability. A reconnaissance platform so advanced that detection would become meaningless because interception would prove impossible. The technical challenges had seemed insurmountable at first, with test pilots reporting that conventional materials simply disintegrated at the speeds required, their aircraft becoming flying furnaces that cooked instruments and melted rivets. Kelly Johnson, the legendary designer whose previous creations had already made history, pushed his team beyond exhaustion, demanding solutions to problems that physics suggested were unsolvable. They discovered that titanium, carefully shaped and treated, could survive the thermal punishment, though acquiring sufficient quantities required elaborate shell companies purchasing the metal from Soviet suppliers who unknowingly provided materials for their own obsolescence. The engines burned a special fuel that remained stable at extreme temperatures, though it was so volatile that ground crews joked about working inside a bomb factory. Wind tunnel tests produced data that seemed fantastical, suggesting the aircraft would actually expand several inches during flight as heat transformed its structure, requiring panels that deliberately fit loosely on the ground. By the summer, when Soviet radar operators still basked in their presumed supremacy, American test pilots were already pushing the Blackbird beyond 3 times the speed of sound at altitudes where the sky turned purple and the curvature of the Earth became visible. Each test flight generated intelligence that confirmed what the Pentagon desperately needed to believe, that this machine could penetrate any airspace without permission and photograph anything below, with cameras so powerful they could read license plates from 16 miles high. The Strategic Air Command received briefings that made generals smile for the first time since the previous incident. Presentation slides showing projected flight paths that slice through defended territories like hot knives. Through butter. Authorization for operational missions came swiftly, signed by officials eager to restore American prestige and reclaim the advantage in the deadly game of Cold War espionage that determined which superpower truly controlled the chessboard. The Blackbird's first operational missions targeted territories where Soviet defenses stood thickest, a deliberate provocation designed to demonstrate invulnerability and gather intelligence about the very systems that would attempt its destruction. Pilots selected for these flights underwent psychological screening that rivaled astronaut selection, because flying at such extremes required nerves of titanium matching their aircraft's skin. Men who could remain calm while traveling faster than their own sound across skies belonging to the enemy. Their pressure suits resembled spacesuits because at those altitudes, any cockpit breach meant death within seconds, the thin atmosphere offering nothing human lungs could process. As these ravens of reconnaissance lifted from secret bases and turned their noses toward the Soviet heartland, they carried cameras loaded with film and crews armed with confidence that their machine represented technological superiority, impossible to challenge, untouchable, and supreme. Senior Lieutenant Viktor Petrov had been monitoring the same sector of Soviet airspace for 7 years, his eyes trained to recognize every blip and echo that appeared on the green phosphorescent screen before him, each aircraft leaving a signature as familiar as a neighbor's face. The radar station sat buried in concrete, 30 meters below the Ural Mountains, its rotating antenna sweeping the heavens in methodical circles while operators chain-smoked cheap cigarettes and drank tea that had gone cold hours before their shift ended. On that particular autumn morning, when frost already covered the birch forests above, Petrov noticed something that made his hand freeze halfway to his mouth, a return signal moving across his display at a speed that violated every parameter in the manual sitting dog-eared beside his console. His first assumption was equipment malfunction, perhaps moisture in the circuits or a power surge from the temperamental generators that kept their underground facility functioning. But the contact remained solid and steady, tracking a straight line that suggested purpose rather than atmospheric aberration. "Comrade Major, I have an unidentified contact bearing 270 altitude reading beyond scale, velocity exceeding any known aircraft capability," Petrov reported, his voice tight with the discipline that prevented him from expressing the confusion churning through his mind. Major Konstantin Sokolov crossed the operations room in 4 strides, his boots echoing against concrete floors that never saw sunlight, peering over Petrov's shoulder at the impossible reading that seemed to mock their sophisticated Soviet technology. The numbers suggested an aircraft flying higher than their ceiling measurements could properly register, moving at speeds that belonged to missiles rather than manned platforms, maintaining a trajectory that would carry it directly over restricted military zones. Sokolov grabbed the secure telephone connecting them to regional command, his knuckles white against the receiver as he delivered a report that sounded absurd even to his own ears. describing a phantom that seemed to dance just beyond the reach of systems designed to guard the motherland against any intrusion. Within minutes, additional stations confirmed the contact, their reports flooding into command centers where generals stared at plotting boards showing a single aircraft penetrating defenses that were supposed to be impenetrable, flying with the arrogance of complete immunity. Fighter squadrons received scramble orders that sent pilots racing to their interceptors, engines screaming to life as MiGs launched into cold morning air with instructions to identify and challenge the intruder. The pilots climbed hard, pushing their aircraft toward maximum altitude, while ground controllers fed them vectors toward the target, their voices growing increasingly frustrated as the numbers revealed the futility of their pursuit. At 40,000 feet, straining at the edges of their performance envelope, the interceptor pilots saw nothing above them but empty purple sky. Their radars picking up a contact so far beyond their reach, it might as well have been orbiting the moon. Back in his underground station, Petrov watched the track continue its inexorable march across Soviet territory, photographing installations and recording secrets, while their entire air defense network stood helpless below, reduced to mere witnesses of their own obsolescence. The humiliation burned deeper than anger, a cold realization settling over every operator and pilot who understood that something fundamental had shifted in the balance of power, that American technology had leaped beyond Soviet capability in ways that made their pride seem foolish. When the contact finally departed Soviet airspace hours later, moving with the same untouchable speed that had marked its entrance, the silence in the operations room carried the weight of defeat without battle, violation without consequence, a new era where Soviet skies belonged to whoever possessed machines fast enough to ignore the guardians below. The mahogany doors of the Kremlin conference room closed with a hollow thud that seemed to seal the assembled officers inside a tomb of their own inadequacy, cutting them off from the Moscow winter that pressed against bulletproof windows overlooking Red Square. General Secretary Brezhnev sat at the head of the table's polished surface, his thick eyebrows drawn together in an expression that made even the most decorated marshals shift uncomfortably in their leather chairs, while cigarette smoke rose toward chandeliers that had witnessed a century of Russian power and paranoia. Marshal Grechko of the Soviet Air Defense Forces spread reconnaissance reports across the table like accusations, each document confirming what everyone in that room already understood but refused to speak aloud until this moment demanded honesty over ideology. The photographs showed radar tracks from 17 different stations, all telling the same impossible story of an American aircraft that had crossed Soviet territory as casually as a man walking through an unlocked door, treating their borders like suggestions rather than barriers defended by thousands of missiles and interceptors. KGB Chairman Andropov sat perfectly still, his thin frame radiating a coldness that had nothing to do with the Moscow weather outside, his mind already calculating the political implications of technological defeat in a system where failure often carried consequences more permanent than mere career damage. Defense Minister Ustinov removed his glasses to clean them with methodical precision, a gesture that allowed him to avoid meeting anyone's eyes while he processed the reality that billions of rubles invested in air defense systems had been rendered obsolete by American engineers working in California desert facilities. The silence stretched until it became unbearable, broken only by the distant chiming of the Kremlin's Spasskaya Tower, marking another hour in a day that would be remembered as the moment Soviet invincibility revealed itself as comfortable fiction rather than military fact. Comrade Marshal, explain to me how a single American aircraft penetrated our defenses for nearly 3 hours without a single missile launched, without a single interceptor achieving visual contact, without anything but reports of our impotence. Brezhnev's voice carried the dangerous quietness of a man whose patience had been excavated down to bedrock. Grechko straightened in his chair, his uniform heavy with medals earned in a different kind of warfare where courage and sacrifice could overcome technological disadvantage, knowing that no amount of decorated history would protect him if he couldn't provide solutions to replace excuses. The general pulled out technical specifications that read like science fiction, describing an aircraft that flew at altitudes exceeding 25,000 meters while traveling at speeds beyond 3 times the speed of sound, parameters that placed it in a realm where Soviet systems simply couldn't function regardless of operator skill or determination. Every missile in their inventory had a ceiling that fell short by several thousand meters. Every interceptor possessed a maximum altitude that left them climbing uselessly toward a target already disappearing over the horizon. Every radar struggled to maintain locks on something moving faster than the systems were designed to track. Andropov leaned forward, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, in a gesture that reminded everyone present of his capacity for finding scapegoats when technical failures needed human faces to explain them to the Politburo. The discussion turned to possibilities and desperate measures, proposals for modifications that might extend missile ranges or aircraft ceilings, suggestions that everyone in the room recognized as inadequate responses to a problem that demanded fundamental technological breakthroughs rather than incremental improvements. The meeting stretched past midnight, long after the secretaries outside had gone home and the Kremlin's corridors had emptied. While inside that room, Soviet leadership confronted the uncomfortable truth that American technology had achieved a superiority that couldn't be dismissed through propaganda or concealed behind Iron Curtain secrecy. The only consensus reached before dawn broke over Moscow's Golden Domes was the establishment of an emergency research program, resources to be allocated without limit, scientists to be mobilized from every institute across 11 time zones, all focused on developing countermeasures to an aircraft that had transformed Soviet airspace into an American photography studio. Ustinov scribbled notes about accelerating the MiG project already underway, pushing engineers to create an interceptor capable of matching the Blackbird's performance, even if it meant sacrificing range, endurance, and every other consideration to achieve the speed and altitude necessary to challenge American impunity. Grechko outlined plans for new surface-to-air missile systems with extended envelopes, though his voice carried little conviction that such weapons could be deployed quickly enough to matter in the immediate crisis that had already undermined Soviet prestige. The psychological dimension worried Andropov most intensely. The knowledge that word of American overflights would spread through military ranks and intelligence networks, corroding the confidence that held their strategic posture together, forcing them to assume every secret had been photographed and every defensive position mapped with precision that made concealment meaningless. As the officers finally departed into Moscow's pre-dawn darkness, each man carried the weight of knowing their world had changed overnight, that the comfortable assumptions of Soviet technological parity had been shattered by an aircraft whose very existence challenged the foundations of their military doctrine. The Kremlin's walls had witnessed defeats before. Armies turned back and plans abandoned, but this was different. A bloodless invasion that couldn't be repelled through courage or sacrifice, only through scientific achievement that currently seemed beyond their reach. Behind those mahogany doors, in a room still thick with smoke and anxiety, the maps remained spread across the table, showing the Blackbird's route like a scar across Soviet pride. A wound that would drive decisions and drain resources for decades to come in pursuit of technological redemption. The SR-71 Blackbird sat on the frozen runway at Kadena Air Base in Okinawa like a predator coiled before the strike, its titanium skin gleaming dull black under floodlights that made the pre-dawn darkness retreat into the surrounding jungle where morning hadn't yet penetrated. Major Thomas Crane completed his pre-flight checks inside the cockpit that felt less like an aircraft interior and more like a spacecraft designed for environments where human beings had no natural business existing, surrounded by instruments monitoring temperatures that would melt conventional aircraft and pressures that could kill an unprotected man in seconds. His flight suit hung loose on his frame because the extreme altitudes ahead would cause his body to swell against the fabric, a reminder that this mission operated at the absolute edge of human physiological tolerance, where only technology stood between survival and death by decompression. Behind him, Lieutenant David Walsh ran through navigation coordinates that would take them across the Soviet coastline and deep into denied territory, following a route calculated to photograph military installations that American intelligence believed held the next generation of intercontinental ballistic missiles capable of reaching Washington within 30 minutes of launch. The external fuel tanks attached to the Blackbird's belly carried the volatile mixture that would burn at temperatures hot enough to require special metallurgy, every component engineered to function in conditions that existed nowhere else in aviation, except inside this singular aircraft that represented a decade of American aerospace genius. Ground crews made final adjustments with the practiced efficiency of men who understood they were servicing something unprecedented, a machine that pushed against the boundaries of physics itself with an arrogance that only American cold war confidence could conceive and execute. The twin engines began their startup sequence with a sound like controlled apocalypse, afterburners igniting with flame that turned night into artificial noon across the runway, where security personnel turned away from the glare that could damage unprotected eyes. The Blackbird accelerated down the runway with a violence that pressed Crane back into his seat, hard enough to make breathing require conscious effort. The aircraft shedding its earthbound weight with visible reluctance before suddenly committing to flight and clawing upward at an angle that seemed to defy every principle of conventional aviation. The climb took them through cloud layers that existed in a lower, gentler atmosphere than their destination, passing commercial airline altitudes where passenger jets cruised in blissful ignorance thousands of feet below the realm where the SR-71 operated in lonely supremacy above all other air traffic. The cockpit instruments showed their speed building past twice the speed of sound and continuing to accelerate with a steadiness that made the extraordinary seem routine, while outside the canopy, the sky transformed from blue to purple to the deep indigo that preceded the black of space itself. They leveled off at an altitude where the Earth's curve became visible on the horizon, where the air was so thin that conventional aircraft engines would flame out from oxygen starvation. But the SR-71's specialized propulsion system thrived in this hostile environment designed for missiles rather than manned flight. Walsh called out the approaching Soviet coastline with professional calm that concealed the adrenaline spike that came from knowing they were about to violate the airspace of a nuclear superpower whose leaders would order their deaths without hesitation if capability matched intention. The reconnaissance cameras activated automatically as they crossed into Soviet territory, high-resolution lenses beginning their methodical documentation of military secrets, while below them, radar operators stared at screens, showing a contact moving faster than anything in their experience suggested was possible. This was the mission's purpose, distilled to its essence. American technology asserting dominance through the simple act of going where Soviet defenses couldn't stop them, gathering intelligence with the casual impunity of absolute aerial supremacy that turned sovereignty into a concept rather than a reality. The radio crackled with Soviet transmissions that Walsh monitored through equipment designed to intercept enemy communications, hearing the confusion and alarm in voices speaking Russian orders to interceptors being scrambled from bases now sliding past beneath them like toys arranged on a map. MiG fighters climbed desperately toward their altitude, But the physics were merciless, leaving Soviet pilots burning fuel in futile pursuit, while the Blackbird maintained its cruise speed that made their best efforts appear in slow motion by comparison. Crane watched his instruments with the focus of a man whose survival depended on maintaining parameters within margins that allowed no deviation, monitoring temperatures that climbed toward levels where even titanium began to soften, managing fuel consumption across tanks that fed engines demanding constant attention to keep the delicate balance between power and catastrophic failure. The cameras below captured image after image of missile silos and radar installations, airfields and command bunkers, everything American intelligence needed to understand Soviet strategic capabilities and plan countermeasures that would maintain the nuclear balance, preventing World War III through mutual assured destruction. The mission profile took them on at Kapustin Yar air defense complex. Senior Lieutenant Viktor Petrov stood in the dimly lit radar room, where cigarette smoke hung like fog beneath flickering fluorescent tubes, staring at the screen, showing a contact that violated every assumption his 5 years of training had taught him about what aircraft could accomplish. The blip moved across Soviet airspace at speeds. His equipment registered, but his mind struggled to accept. A phosphorescent dot representing American arrogance, cruising at altitudes where his best missiles lost guidance and tumbled back to Earth like spent fireworks. He shouted coordinates to the launch crews outside, who worked in frantic choreography around missile batteries that represented the cutting edge of Soviet aerospace defense technology, weapons designed by the motherland's finest engineers, yet suddenly rendered obsolete by whatever flew overhead with casual immunity. The launch klaxon wailed across the frozen steppe as surface-to-air missiles ignited and climbed on pillars of flame that illuminated the pre-dawn darkness. Their trajectories calculated by computers that couldn't compensate for a target moving faster than their programming anticipated. Petrov watched the missiles reach their maximum altitude and detonate in desperate proximity fuses, creating brief flowers of fire miles below the American intruder that continued unaffected along its intelligence gathering route. His communications officer fielded calls from Moscow, demanding explanations he couldn't provide, asking why expensive missiles, launched from supposedly impregnable defenses, accomplished nothing except confirming their own inadequacy. The humiliation sat in his stomach like spoiled meat, souring every breath with the taste of technological inferiority that no ideology could rationalize away. At Dolinsk Airfield on Sakhalin Island, Captain Mikhail Kozlov pushed his MiG-25 interceptor past red-line specifications that would require engine replacement after landing, assuming he survived the attempt to reach an altitude where American spy planes photographed Soviet secrets with impunity that mocked everything his uniform represented. The afterburners screamed with a sound like tearing metal as he climbed through 40,000 feet and continued upward into air so thin his engines barely sustained combustion, the aircraft shaking with vibrations that suggested imminent structural failure. His radar operator called out the target ahead and above, a contact maintaining speeds that made interception a mathematical impossibility unless the Americans chose to slow down out of pity. Kozlov's altimeter showed heights where conventional fighters couldn't function, where his pressurized cockpit protected him from an environment that would boil his blood in. Seconds of exposure, yet still, the American remained beyond reach. He fired missiles in frustration more than tactical calculation, watching them arc upward and lose tracking as they entered air, too rarefied for their control surfaces to maintain guidance. The fuel warning lights illuminated across his instrument panel like accusations of failure, forcing him to break off pursuit and descend back to thicker atmosphere where his aircraft could breathe. As he turned homeward, Kozlov glimpsed contrails far above, scratched across the stratosphere by engines that made Soviet technology appear primitive by comparison. The command bunker beneath Moscow processed reports from a dozen radar stations, tracking the American violation, each transmission confirming what General Yevgeny Volkov already understood with clarity that made his chest tight with suppressed rage. They were helpless. The war room's strategic map showed the SR-71's route, marked in red like a wound across Soviet territory, penetrating defenses that consumed billions of rubles. Yet stopped nothing when American intelligence decided to collect photographs. Junior officers avoided eye contact as they delivered updates on failed intercepts and wasted ordnance, their voices carrying the deflated tone of men reporting predictable defeats. Volkov had commanded air defenses through conflicts where Soviet aircraft dominated skies through superior numbers and acceptable losses. But this situation inverted every advantage into liability through simple technological supremacy. The American Blackbird transformed Soviet airspace into a free-fire photography studio where missiles fell short and interceptors arrived too late, demonstrating with each violation that borders were concepts enforced by capability rather than sovereignty. He dictated orders for engineers to accelerate development programs that might threaten high-altitude reconnaissance within years, knowing that today they remained impotent spectators to their own humiliation. The secure telephone to the Kremlin sat silent on his desk, like judgment, deferred, waiting for politicians to demand explanations that no military jargon could disguise. Back at Kapustin Yar, Petrov watched the American contact exit Soviet airspace with the same untroubled speed it had entered, completing its intelligence mission without a single evasive maneuver, because none had been necessary against defenses it simply ignored. The younger radar operators looked to him for reassurance he couldn't provide, their faces showing cracks in the confidence that propaganda had instilled about Soviet military invincibility in protecting the motherland from capitalist aggression. Outside, the missile crews performed post-launch procedures with shoulders slumped in, postures that spoke louder than any debriefing about their sense of futility against threats that operated beyond their weapons' reach. Petrov filled out incident reports with mechanical precision, documenting another failure in bureaucratic language that would climb the command chain to Moscow, where men in warmer offices would read his professional admission of impotence. The morning sun rose over the complex, illuminating equipment that suddenly seemed quaint and insufficient, built to specifications that American aerospace engineers had surpassed while Soviet industry struggled to match yesterday's capabilities. He lit another cigarette and inhaled smoke that tasted like defeat, wondering how many more American violations they would track helplessly before politicians stopped pretending Soviet air defenses controlled their own airspace. The radar screen showed clear skies now empty of impossible contacts, returning to the routine surveillance of predictable aircraft flying at reasonable altitudes where Soviet missiles could reach them. In the closed research city of Zhukovsky, where even Soviet citizens required special permits to enter, Chief Engineer Dmitry Volgin presided over aircraft design bureaus that operated under pressure unlike anything peacetime engineering had witnessed, transforming the SR-71 humiliation into fuel for innovation born from wounded national pride and genuine fear of technological obsolescence. The cavernous hangars housed prototype interceptors in various stages of completion, titanium airframes that pushed Soviet metallurgy to its absolute limits, while cost accountants calculated expenses that made finance ministry officials blanch at budget meetings conducted under KGB supervision. Volgin walked between workstations where exhausted engineers drafted modifications to the MiG-25 design, increasing engine thrust and altitude ceilings through brute force solutions that sacrificed longevity for performance, because bringing down one American spy plane justified burning through a dozen interceptors. The design philosophy accepted limitations that capitalist inefficiency might reject: single-use components, dangerous fuel loads, operational tolerances that flirted with catastrophic failure, all deemed acceptable trade-offs if they closed the performance gap between Soviet desperation and American superiority. Wind tunnel tests ran continuously through night shifts as teams refined aerodynamics for flight regimes their predecessors had considered theoretical abstractions rather than operational requirements. Surface-to-air missile development consumed parallel resources at research facilities across the Soviet Union, where weapons designers competed for funding to create the system that might finally threaten high-altitude reconnaissance platforms currently operating with immunity that demoralized everyone who witnessed their arrogant overflights. Colonel Engineer Anatoly Berezin commanded teams developing improved guidance systems that could track targets moving at speeds existing radars struggled to process continuously, knowing that missile velocity meant nothing without accuracy against aircraft crossing Soviet territory, faster than telephone reports could travel between ground stations. His prototype seekers incorporated new infrared sensors designed to lock onto engine heat signatures from previously impossible ranges, technology reverse-engineered from captured Western components and improved through Soviet innovation born from necessity rather than academic curiosity. The test ranges in Kazakhstan witnessed daily launches that consumed budgets equivalent to small cities' annual expenditures, each firing providing data that incrementally improved performance toward thresholds where American pilots might finally experience the vulnerabilities Soviet defenders endured constantly. Berezin reviewed telemetry from another near miss that qualified as progress only because previous attempts had failed more completely, his reports to Moscow carefully optimistic about timelines measured in years, while American reconnaissance continued unimpeded today. The psychological weight on these engineering teams manifested in cigarette consumption that tripled during development cycles and divorce rates that reflected how national security demanded personal sacrifices from men who rarely saw sunlight outside their classified workshops, filled with blueprints marked with red stamps indicating state secrecy. Young engineers arrived enthusiastic about contributing to Soviet technological advancement and aged rapidly under pressure from military overseers who attended every design review with questions about why American aerospace accomplished what Soviet industry struggled to match, despite ideological superiority that supposedly guaranteed scientific progress. Volgin recognized burnout in faces around conference tables where technical discussions became referendums on professional competence and patriotic dedication. Every setback interpreted as potential sabotage by security officers whose presence ensured nobody spoke freely about fundamental resource limitations hampering their work. The Research City operated as a pressure cooker, converting humiliation into incremental improvements that might eventually threaten American reconnaissance operations. Assuming Soviet engineering could close gaps that widened each time intelligence reported new American capabilities, success arrived in fractional measures: missiles that climbed slightly higher, interceptors that sustained extreme altitudes for additional seconds, radar systems that maintained tracking through maneuvers previously impossible to follow. Each advancement celebrated with restrained optimism because everyone understood that American engineers weren't standing still while Soviet facilities worked desperately to catch up. The prototype interceptors bore designations that would eventually become operational aircraft, like the improved MiG-25, machines built around singular purposes of reaching altitudes where American spy planes operated with current impunity that could not continue indefinitely if Soviet determination matched American innovation. Volgin submitted progress reports documenting achievements measured in percentages and incremental capability improvements, knowing that generals wanted absolute solutions, while engineers delivered realistic advances constrained by physics, budgets, and time requirements that political pressure couldn't abbreviate. The technological race transformed Soviet aerospace development into a marathon run at sprint pace, sustainable only through sacrifices that left permanent marks on everyone involved in chasing aircraft that remained frustratingly ahead, despite exhaustive efforts to close the performance gap through engineering prowess and sheer determination. The invulnerability of American reconnaissance aircraft carved wounds deeper than operational failures into Soviet military consciousness, transforming professional soldiers into witnesses of their own inadequacy every time distant contrails marked another untouchable overflight crossing, protected airspace with contemptuous immunity. In officers' clubs from Murmansk to Vladivostok, conversations that once celebrated Soviet air defense supremacy now carried undertones of bitter resignation as pilots recounted futile intercept attempts that ended with fuel exhaustion rather than enemy engagement, their personal failures becoming metaphors for systemic inadequacy that no amount of vodka could completely numb. Young lieutenants who had joined believing Marxist ideology guaranteed technological superiority discovered through humiliating experience that American capitalists somehow produced aircraft their socialist equivalents couldn't touch, despite theoretical advantages their academy instructors had promised with absolute certainty. The morale corrosion spread through defensive networks like rust, through compromised metal, each successful American penetration confirming what propaganda couldn't contradict. Soviet technology lagged behind adversaries who operated with arrogance, justified by performance gaps. No amount of revolutionary spirit could bridge through determination alone. General Viktor Petrov recognized the demoralization during inspection tours of radar stations, where operators tracked contacts they couldn't engage, watching screens display American reconnaissance paths plotted with casual disregard for defenses that existed only theoretically against aircraft, flying beyond practical interception envelopes. He observed the exhaustion in faces of MiG pilots who scrambled repeatedly toward targets they couldn't reach, returning with fuel warnings and empty weapons while American crews photographed installations. These same pilots were sworn to protect, but couldn't defend against surveillance conducted in broad daylight. Petrov's reports to Moscow carefully documented technical deficiencies without explicitly stating what everyone understood. American aerospace engineers had created operational capabilities Soviet industry couldn't match, despite resources poured into programs that delivered incremental improvements rather than revolutionary solutions. The psychological impact manifested in transfer requests from elite units, where serving became daily reminders of inadequacy, pilots seeking positions where their failures wouldn't be quite so visible against contrails 40,000 meters overhead, marking American freedom from Soviet reach. The propaganda apparatus struggled against reality that crews witnessed personally. Official statements about impenetrable defenses contradicted by radar tracks showing American aircraft crossing Soviet territory as casually as domestic flights, navigating approved corridors without deviation or concern. Zampolit political officers delivered ideological speeches about capitalist weaknesses to audiences who had watched those supposedly inferior adversaries operate untouchable reconnaissance platforms, while Soviet responses proved consistently inadequate despite patriotic dedication and tactical competence. Factory workers assembling interceptors heard rumors from frontline units about the futility of equipment they produced with careful precision, their labor-feeding military systems that couldn't accomplish primary defensive missions against adversaries who demonstrated superiority through operational actions rather than propaganda claims. The cognitive dissonance between official narratives and experienced reality created cynicism that security services noted with concern in reports documenting morale problems that couldn't be resolved. Through additional political education or disciplinary measures, Recognition arrived privately that American technological achievements represented advantages measured in years rather than months, requiring Soviet responses beyond what current capabilities could deliver, despite maximum effort from personnel who gave everything except results. Matching their dedication, the SR-71 became a symbol haunting Soviet military consciousness, like a ghost that appeared regularly to remind defenders of their inadequacy, its invulnerability transforming operational failures into existential questions about systemic competence that undermined confidence in ways enemy propaganda never could through mere words alone. The closest Soviet defense forces came to destroying an SR-71 occurred over the Kola Peninsula, when a radar operator named Lieutenant Yuri Sokolov detected the American reconnaissance aircraft entering his sector precisely as intelligence reports had predicted, creating a rare opportunity for coordinated interception that transformed routine duty into desperate pursuit against an adversary that had always escaped untouched before. Sokolov's voice cracked with urgency as he transmitted vectors to MiG interceptors already airborne on patrol, his calculations accounting for the Blackbird's incredible velocity, while ground crews activated missile batteries positioned along the predicted flight path, creating a gauntlet of fire that represented years of preparation for exactly this scenario. The tension in the command bunker became suffocating as officers crowded around tracking displays showing converging vectors that suggested possible engagement, decades of frustration condensing into moments where Soviet technology might finally prove adequate against American aviation superiority that had humiliated defenses through countless violations. Captain Dmitry Volkov pushed his MiG interceptor beyond recommended operational limits, altitude warnings screaming in his headset while he climbed toward the target, moving across his radar scope like a meteor, indifferent to pursuit from below. His breathing came in gasps through the oxygen mask as cabin pressure decreased with altitude, vision narrowing at the edges, while he maintained focus on the intercept geometry that placed him closer to firing position than any previous attempt had achieved against the legendary American reconnaissance platform. Volkov's finger hovered over the weapons release as his targeting radar struggled to maintain lock against the SR-71's electronic countermeasures and extreme altitude, the moment stretching into eternity, while he waited for tone confirmation that would authorize missile launch against the ghost that had haunted Soviet airspace. Ground controllers transmitted constant updates, creating cacophony in his helmet, their voices betraying excitement that this might finally be the engagement that ended American invulnerability through skill and determination, despite technical disadvantages. The SR-71 crew detected multiple threats converging below their position, pilot and reconnaissance officer, executing practiced countermeasures while maintaining course over strategic targets, with professional composure that came from knowing their aircraft's capabilities exceeded Soviet interception envelopes by margins calculated through physics rather than courage. Satellite communication relayed real-time intelligence updates about the aggressive Soviet response. Mission commanders in secure facilities thousands of miles distant, monitoring the situation while trusting aircraft performance and crew skill to overcome coordinated defenses, representing Moscow's best tactical effort. The Blackbird sensors continued photographing installations below, while defensive systems tracked missiles. Launched in desperation by commanders who understood, this represented perhaps their only opportunity to demonstrate capability against adversaries who had operated with immunity for years. Volkov's missile streaked upward, trailing fire visible from ground stations where personnel watched through binoculars, hopes rising as the weapon climbed toward intercept altitude before its motor exhausted at maximum range, leaving it tumbling harmlessly beneath the SR-71 that continued undisturbed along its reconnaissance path. The American aircraft disappeared from Soviet radar coverage. Minutes later, having completed its mission objectives, leaving behind only contrails and the crushing disappointment of another failure that came closer than any previous attempt, yet remained ultimately inadequate against technological superiority that no amount of determination could overcome. The Kremlin archives from those final Cold War decades revealed documents stamped with classification levels that betrayed profound strategic anxiety. Intelligence assessments concluding that American reconnaissance capabilities demonstrated technological advantages extending far beyond aviation into computing, materials science, and systems integration that threatened Soviet strategic parity across multiple domains. Marshal Nikolai Ogarkov reviewed satellite photographs showing American military installations with resolution demonstrating superiority, matching the SR-71's impunity, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he briefed Politburo members in smoky conference rooms where decisions affecting millions compressed into hours of debate among aging leaders haunted by superiority gaps they couldn't close through ideology or determination. The Blackbird's continued violations became psychological warfare more devastating than physical destruction, each mission reinforcing perceptions that Soviet defenses remained perpetually inadequate despite massive investment in technologies designed specifically to counter American advantages that always stayed beyond reach. Defense expenditures escalated dramatically as Moscow diverted resources from civilian sectors toward military programs, attempting to match capabilities demonstrated by aircraft that represented merely visible symbols of deeper American technological dominance. The economic strain contributing to systemic weaknesses that would eventually fracture Soviet society itself. Young radar operators entering service during those final years received training emphasizing detection protocols for aircraft. Their instructors privately acknowledged they couldn't intercept, the contradiction breeding cynicism that infected military culture throughout defense forces, increasingly aware their sacrifice served political narratives rather than genuine strategic capability. Lieutenant Pavel Medvedev sat before tracking screens in modernized facilities that still couldn't prevent American reconnaissance flights. His shift reports documenting violations with bureaucratic precision that masked frustration shared across installations stretching from Baltic shores to Pacific coasts, where sovereignty existed only in rhetoric rather than enforced reality. Senior officers delivered speeches about eventual technological parity while privately requesting transfers away from air defense commands where failure defined daily experience regardless of individual competence or dedication to duty, that circumstances rendered meaningless. The psychological impact cascaded through ranks, creating demoralization that extended beyond aviation into broader questions about Soviet capabilities across confrontation domains, where American advantages seemed insurmountable despite official propaganda promising inevitable victory through socialist superiority. Intelligence agencies devoted enormous resources tracking SR-71 operations, hoping to identify vulnerabilities that might restore defensive credibility. Analysts examining every sensor reading and pilot report for patterns suggesting exploitable weaknesses in aircraft that continued performing flawlessly through hundreds of missions over hostile territory. The KGB established dedicated sections monitoring American aerospace developments, recruiting sources, and intercepting communications in desperate attempts to acquire technologies or intelligence enabling countermeasures against capabilities that remained frustratingly beyond Soviet reach. Despite comprehensive espionage efforts, satellite tracking stations recorded every Blackbird deployment, building databases that revealed operational patterns without providing solutions to fundamental performance gaps separating American reconnaissance platforms from Soviet defensive systems that couldn't overcome physics, determining engagement envelopes. This intelligence obsession diverted counterintelligence resources from other priorities, creating vulnerabilities that American agencies exploited, while Soviet focus remained fixed on aviation superiority they couldn't challenge through conventional means. The SR-71's retirement in the 1990s arrived not from Soviet success, but American technological advancement, rendering even the legendary Blackbird obsolete. Satellites and stealth aircraft providing reconnaissance capabilities without requiring manned penetration of hostile airspace that had defined Cold War intelligence gathering for decades. Soviet officers monitoring that final announcement experienced contradictory emotions, mixing relief at cessation of humiliating violations with resentment that retirement came from American choice rather than Soviet capability, finally achieving parity after decades pursuing impossible standards. The Blackbird's legacy persisted in Russian military doctrine, emphasizing air defense investments and technological development programs, attempting to prevent future scenarios where adversaries operated with similar impunity against defenses, proven inadequate throughout sustained competition. Museums displaying retired SR-71 airframes became pilgrimage sites where former Soviet military personnel stood silently before aircraft, representing their professional frustration. The gleaming titanium surfaces reflecting both American achievement and Russian determination that circumstances never allowed to achieve vindication. They desperately sought through careers defined by pursuing shadows they couldn't catch. Could Soviet determination ever have overcome American technological superiority, or was the outcome inevitable from the beginning? Subscribe to explore more untold Cold War stories that shaped our world.